guys, Candice Malcolm here. Welcome to another week of our program, This Week in Fake News. Thanks so much for tuning in. As usual, we have a super busy week, lots going on, and so let's just jump right into it. This is a show where we talk about the most biased stories, the most torqued stories, and all the fake news in Canada. So we have a couple of contenders this week for the worst example of just very biased or very sloppy journalism. The first one comes to us from our friends over at the Huffington Post. Now, this story came up on, I think it was Tuesday night, and almost right away, like immediately as soon as the story was posted, conservative insiders, people who have worked in the Conservative Party in the past, just completely debunked this story, and yet here it is, it remains up online. So here's a headline: Andrew Scheer agreed with controversial anti-gay comments, ex-MP claims. So the story is that when Andrew Scheer was a young man in 2003, he was working for an MP in his hometown in Saskatchewan, I guess the town where he had moved, because he was originally from Ottawa. He moved to Saskatchewan. And he was working for the Canadian Alliance MP Larry Spencer. Now, in 2003, Spencer made very inflammatory remarks about homosexuality. And even at the time in the Canadian Alliance movement, Canadian Alliance Party, which was run by Stephen Harper, who went on to become Prime Minister, even in 2003, that was not okay. And so Harper turfed this guy, he got fired and left the party. Now, the story claims that Andrew Scheer, even though the MP had been kicked out of the party, Andrew Scheer stayed on to work for this MP, and the MP claims that that was because Scheer agreed with Mr. Spencer's inflammatory comments. So the whole story is just suggesting basically that Andrew Scheer agreed with these controversial comments. He was 25 years old at the time. And then it goes into this basically just like a long laundry list of accusations against Andrew Scheer, making it seem like he's just this horrible homophobic person. And it goes on and on and on and on. Now, the only problem with this story is that it's not true. It's completely false and it's fake news. So Ian Brody went on Twitter almost immediately when the story broke, and he writes, "I can contradict Larry Spencer on this story, this breaking tonight, owing to firsthand experience." So Ian Brody is a political scientist and a professor. And back in 2003, when the story was happening, he was the chief of staff to Stephen Harper. He went on to become the chief of staff to the Prime Minister when Harper became Prime Minister. So here is Brody completely refuting the story. He says, "At the time of Spencer's comments, I was assistant chief of staff in Mr. Harper's office. After Mr. Spencer was ejected from the Canadian Alliance caucus, I worked to sort out issues in Mr. Spencer's riding. This included dealing with the riding association, Mr. Spencer's principal donors, and his staff. I don't remember anyone agreeing with Mr. Spencer's comments. Andrew Scheer specifically stayed behind for a short time to ensure some constituent files were properly closed. Passport problems, EI, and so forth, routine constituent stuff. He and everyone else knew these files mattered to the constituents seeking help. We all understood that Mr. Scheer would remain with the party and agreed that Mr. Spencer's comments were not acceptable. He underlined that when he ran a few months later and defeated the local MP and NDP MP in the riding." So there you go. Ian Brody was there. Ian Brody was working with Andrew Scheer. Ian Brody was part of the Canadian Alliance. And so for the Huffington Post to just sort of go out and claim that Scheer was on the wrong side of this issue and that he sided with the MP that got turfed from the Canadian Alliance, that doesn't add up, because a few months later, Scheer ran for that party. So presumably if he was agreeing with the MP who left the party, he wouldn't be welcomed back a few months later to run as an MP. And then here you have Ian Brody completely contradicting the story. So after a lot of sort of people calling out this just total fake news story, Althea Raj, who's the editor over at Huffington Post, jumps in and basically just says, her excuse for putting up this piece was basically that the Conservatives didn't get back to her in time. Interestingly, here's Brock Harrison, and he is Andrew Scheer's Director of Communications, and he puts this comment out: Mr. Spencer is wrong. As Mr. Scheer said in 2004, when the issue came up in the local campaign, he absolutely disagreed with Mr. Spencer's comments. Mr. Scheer continues to condemn any hateful comments towards LGBTQ Canadians." So he said, here's what we sent to the HuffPo, and it was not quoted in the story. So here we have it. Huffington Post was sent a story was sent a quote from the Conservatives, and they just chose not to put it in. And this quote still doesn't appear in the story. And then here's Althea Raj coming back saying, basically here, she says, Brock, you can say at any time that Scheer disagrees. You haven't. But that's not true, because if you just look back at the very previous tweet, the second thing that he says right here, Mr. Spencer's wrong, and Mr. Scheer said, as Mr. Scheer said in 2004, when the issue came up in the local campaign, he absolutely disagreed with Mr. Spencer's comments. So Harrison says right here, Scheer disagrees with the comments. And then Althea Raj says, Brock, you said at the time that Scheer disagrees. You haven't. You can say at the time that Scheer disagrees. You haven't. Anyway, this is just sort of strange because it's like they're talking past each other clearly. But, for all the people who don't go on Twitter and don't see the insider talk between, all the people who are in the back rooms, the editors, the spokespeople, the chief of staff at the time, they just see this very inflammatory headline that basically just says Andrew Scheer's a bigot. He hates gay people. And it's not true. It's super irresponsible. So this is basically like a political campaign. This is political spin. It's very biased. It's untrue. It's more like political activism based on an ideology than it is straight journalism, straight reporting. And it's super unfortunate because so many Canadians will just see that and they won't realize the truth. And it's also a little concerning because Althea Raj, who, she's a nice person and, she's a professional, but she is a debate moderator. She's moderating one of the debates, and she's clearly got a bias, and her outlet is putting out total fake news that's very biased, that comes across more like a political hit campaign against the Conservatives as opposed to straight journalism. Okay, so let's move on. So it's been a crazy week. I'm not going to get too much into the blackface stuff because I feel like that's been covered a lot, but I don't think the story is dead, and we're going to continue to report it over at True North. You can check out what is going on as well with my colleague Andrew Lawton trying to cover the Liberal campaign. It's absolute madness. The Liberals are refusing to let him on the campaign bus, and it's a really interesting story. So I encourage you to check out our website, tnc.news. And I wrote a blog post just summarizing absolutely everything that's happened so far. And you can follow Andrew's own work. He's been putting out lots of stories every day and you can follow his saga on Twitter. So I won't get into that in this podcast, but I do want to talk about the fact that the media, so we're in the middle of an election campaign in Canada. It's a super interesting campaign. There's a lot of things that have come up. I don't think we've really fully gotten to the end of the whole Justin Trudeau wearing blackface issue. I think that there's a lot of stuff that could still come from that. There's a lot of new angles that have come out, like Trudeau now saying that he hasn't worn it since 2001. I think that the issue is not yet exhausted. And there is still a lot of journalism to be done on that issue. But if you were to just sort of follow the news and see what's going on in Canada, you would just completely forget about it because the mainstream media has moved on. I tweeted this picture on Wednesday. The issue here, you can look at the front pages of the National Post and the Globe and Mail. It's about Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi and apparent, impeachment talks in Ukraine and all the stuff. It's like, guys, we have a Canadian election. It's pretty interesting stuff going on. Just given, the fact that the Prime Minister has this really dark past that we're just learning about. There's a lot of still stories that you could report on in Canada. You could report on the fact that Jagmeet Singh and Trudeau had a private conversation the night before. Why wouldn't that be in the newspaper? You could cover the fact that the Liberal Party is blocking a journalist from entering their events. Why isn't that covered in the news? Instead, Canadians are left with, this political jockeying down in Washington that's not really very relevant to us, especially when we have our own election campaign. And you see this time and time again. If I want to watch American news, I can do that. I can turn on CNN or I can buy a copy of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. The reason that we have Canadian news outlets, the reason that they're subsidized by the federal government is because they're supposed to tell Canadian stories. And yet here we have an obsession with what's going on south of the border. And I find it really ironic because for us at True North, we are a Canadian news outlet. We are focused entirely on Canadian journalism, Canadian reporting, Canadian politics. And yet some people in the mainstream media don't recognize us as being a journalism outlet, a media outlet. And then here they are, not even really telling the story of Canadians to Canadians, but obsessing over political theater south of the border. It's pathetic. pathetic. And we have this again. This story absolutely dominated the news. This 16-year-old Swedish girl coming to the United Nations to lecture us and give an absolute bonkers, alarmist speech on climate change. She's a child. She has no idea what she's talking about. I feel sorry for her, watching that speech that she gave. It's like, what kind of propaganda has this child been fed that she believes so obviously, so strongly, so passionately that the planet is coming to an end and that we're about to experience a mass extinction? It makes me worried about the state of propaganda in our education system. I'll say it right out. I believe that global warming is happening. I believe that climate change is real. I believe that human beings probably do have an impact on the climate and that we should probably try to do our best to reduce carbon emissions. Now, that said, I do not think that governments have the power to change the weather. I don't think that the Canadian government or the US government could simply change the weather by changing our activities. And really what these people are calling for and what they would want for society is basically to go back to the Dark Ages. They have completely unrealistic ideas about how to reduce our carbon emissions. And anyway, they're just absolutely alarmists. The left in the political world likes to accuse the right of fear-mongering, of playing on fears and division, and being alarmist when it comes to things like terrorism or national security threats and war. And yet, when you listen to the rhetoric and you hear the things that these people are saying about the climate, it's far worse than anything that people on the right or conservatives do when it comes to terrorism. These people are really fear-mongering, and the fact that they've whipped up little children to believe that there's a Armageddon and we're experiencing mass extinction is just sad. But anyway, so here's a story in CTV News. It says, if looks could kill, Thunberg serves Trump a death stare at UN summit. So again, there's an election going on in Canada, right? There is an important political campaign. We should be asking questions to the leaders. We should be thoroughly vetting every candidate, not just the conservatives, but everyone. And instead, we have a news story here about Twitter banter and weird inside stories between this 16-year-old far-left activist. And I call her far-left because she wore an Antifa t-shirt. Antifa is a domestic terrorist group in the United States. It's considered a terrorist group by agencies within the U.S. government. And they really are far left. They want to dismantle our entire, political and economic system. So this child is as far left as you can get. And, here we have mainstream people cheering her on, joking about wishing that she could kill Donald Trump, giving him a death stare. They quote someone saying, "I wish your death stare was accompanied by a real laser beam." Okay, so you're suggesting that we kill Donald Trump. And they're joking about this on Twitter. And who cares, okay? This is just really strange, really irrelevant when there's an election going on. It's unfortunate that the media think that this is what Canadians care about. It's sort of insulting to our intelligence. And also, I just want to make this point. There's some groups in Canada like to talk about how there's a blurring between the far right and the mainstream right, or mainstream conservatives and the far right. They do it all the time. They like to find links between far right activists, people who are maybe yellow vesters, or people who have made inflammatory white nationalist comments, and then they try to find links between them and just mainstream conservatives, people like myself, or people like someone running for the Conservative Party. And they make a big deal about it. They kind of invent that there's a storyline, and people over at Canadaland are kind of obsessed with this. And it's interesting because you could make the exact same arguments. I don't find that those arguments about the far right and conservatives to be very valid, but you could easily make the argument on the left, because Greta Thunberg is clearly a very far left person, especially the fact that she supports Antifa. Even Nancy Pelosi, who's the head of the Democrats in the US, has condemned Antifa. They're violent. They're thugs, okay? So she supports Antifa. And then you have mainstream liberals like Catherine McKenna, the Canadian Liberal Environment Minister, cheering her on. You have Trudeau and Elizabeth May in Montreal, to try to kind of ride the coattails of this 16-year-old activist. And so you could easily say that there is a blurring of the lines between the mainstream left, liberals, people like Justin Trudeau and Catherine McKenna, and then very far left extremists like Antifa and people who believe that we should just turn our economy off, like turn the off switch and not do anything, never fly, turn off our electricity, shut down oil and gas, and just, go back to the dark ages. So that's more of a problem in my mind, and I don't think that topic has been explored. All right, I'm going to leave it at that. So thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to check out more information about our journalist, Andrew Lawton, and his ordeal, his saga to get onto the Liberal bus, to cover the Liberal bus. Thank you so much to everyone who has donated. We've been able to raise quite a bit of money, which is how we're able to afford to fly Andrew Lawton out to Vancouver, up to Thunder Bay, over to Montreal. We really appreciate those donations. It really helps us with our journalism. And don't forget, I have a new book out. It's called No Border. It's already a bestseller on Amazon. It's about Justin Trudeau and his assault on border security in Canada. We had a 50% off code that I think is still going on, so you get that book for half price, or you can get it for free on Kindle. It's sort of a follow-up to my other book that came out in 2016 called Losing True North, which was more about Trudeau's immigration policies. This one's more about border security. So don't forget to check that out. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great, great weekend. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next week.